Well, welcome to the next panel on Indigenous Charities, and particularly for this panel I'd just like to acknowledge that Melbourne University is located on the land of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Now for this next panel, Annie Keeley, who is at Justice Connect, is going to start talking to us, and we'll set out the landscape a little bit about Indigenous charities and some of the ACNC guidance that exists and issues that may arise, particularly from a lawyer's perspective. Annie's been a lawyer for over 30 years, and most of her work has been with Aboriginal groups and communities, initially on land rights claims, but later on a broader range of matters. And until recently, she was the principal legal officer, she was director of legal policy at the ACNC. Next, Selwyn Button, who is the Registrar of ORIC, will give us the regulator ORIC's perspective around Indigenous charities. Selwyn is a Gungari man from southwest Queensland, and he has extensive experience in the Queensland health and education sectors, and from 2014 to 2018 was Assistant Director General of Indigenous Education in State Schools. And prior to that was CEO of the Queensland Aboriginal and Islander Health Council, amongst other roles. And he served on numerous councils and committees, including Oxfam Australia, Queensland Indigenous Education Consultative Committee, Queensland Council of Social Services, the Lowitja Institute and Queensland Rugby Union. Jacinta Lawson, who will end up our panel discussion, is a director in the ATO, the Australian Taxation Office, working in a not-for-profit centre. And her role provides the government and community with confidence and assurance that NFPs are supported to deliver important services, access the right concessions, operate for purposes, and meet their obligations. So Jacinta will round out the panel by giving us the ATO perspective on the issues that have been raised by the previous two panellists. So I'll say nothing more to ensure that the panel has ample time, and I'll hand over to Annie to speak to you.
Good morning. I wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise their elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded and no treaty has ever been made. The Victorian Government is working on that, which is a good thing, obviously. So this morning I'm going to set the scene for this panel on Indigenous charities, and we're focusing on charities run by Indigenous people rather than the wider range of mainstream charities that do work in Indigenous communities. There'll be a slideshow running in the background just with some, from a range of Indigenous charities, just to reinforce what I'm going to say. So I'm going to touch on three things. The first is just to remind you about the Commissioner's interpretation statement on Indigenous disadvantage on Indigenous charities. The second is just to look at the huge scope and breadth of the work done by Indigenous charities, and finally a couple of tips for the lawyers in the room from somebody who's been around for a while. So the Commissioner's interpretation statement has three main elements. The first is that Indigenous disadvantage is widely recognised and acknowledged by governments, courts, legislation and international bodies. And so for charity registration under this statement, an organisation addressing Indigenous disadvantage is accepted by the ACNC as having a charitable purpose under the first head of charity, of relieving poverty and impotence. And remember, there's no need to use the language of addressing Indigenous disadvantage if it's clear that that's what you're doing. The second is the public benefit test, which used to cause some concern for some. So if the charity is relieving poverty, there's no need to meet the public benefit test. If the charity is addressing the archaic word impotence, there's a presumption of meeting the public benefit test. And as I'm sure you know, that archaic meaning includes being beyond sickness and disability, the underprivileged, the vulnerable and so on. So many charities addressing Indigenous disadvantage will be registered under the statutory purpose of advancing social and public welfare. The second element of the public benefit test that used to be raised from time to time in relation to Indigenous charities was where The members or beneficiaries of the charity were within family groups or descended from apical ancestors, so they're often blood related. And the interpretation statement is explicit that members of an Indigenous charity being blood related or family groups will still be accepted as benefiting a sufficient section of the public, and so it doesn't prevent it from meeting the public benefit test. The issue was subsequently addressed for some charities in the Charities Act. That's for charities that are managing or holding money or benefits that relate to either native title or traditional ownership, so it's a specific group. So I know from discussions with people that there are some who would have liked the Commissioner's interpretation statement to go further, for instance, to address whether these charities will be PBI, will meet the PBI test. And others who have a view about whether there are gaps in relation to economic development organisations, how they fit, but we'll come back to that later in the panel. So I move on to the second part of what I wanted to outline, and that is the very broad range of purposes and services provided by Indigenous charities. So I'm only going to take a minute, but I think it's just worth being reminded of the extraordinary work being done across the country. So I'm aware that there's overlap between my somewhat artificial categories, but I just want you to get a sense of how much is going on out there. At Not-for-Profit Law, we're fortunate to work with some of these organisations in providing them targeted advice, guidance and training, particularly in New South Wales. I'm also conscious that there are some people that have concerns about registered charities being reliant on government funding. But the fact is that many Indigenous charities are providing services that government simply could not provide, either due to lack of trust or previous adverse experience by the communities involved, or governments choose not to provide them and pay someone to provide them for them. So it's not as if it isn't a quite deliberate action. So I'll do this quickly because I'm conscious of time. So there are health and medical services all across the country designed for Indigenous people, and they include unusual things you may not know of, like in the Nunajara, Pitjantjatjara, Yangudjatjara lands, they have nunkeries who are traditional healers who work with hospitals and medical services and nursing homes to ensure that appropriate medical treatment that people will trust is being provided. So there's no way government could do that. Danila Dilba is a service in Darwin, there's Central Australian Aboriginal Congress in Alice Springs and others across the country. So that's first. Second are legal services. So there are Aboriginal legal services across the country that help provide advice and representation in criminal and civil matters. Third, schools and education. So there are independent Aboriginal schools such as Warrawa Aboriginal College in Healesville. There's the Tagai State College on Thursday Island in the Torres Strait. There's Yipperini School in Alice Springs. There are educational associations and peak bodies and schools in other areas as well. So I'm just giving you a scattering of examples. Housing and hostels. So Aboriginal Hostels runs 47 facilities across the country, and there are many housing organisations such as Aboriginal Housing Victoria and others like the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Councils who provide social housing in that state. Aged care and disability services, which include both in-home services and residential care. So down in Portland in Victoria, the DeWort Warung Elderly and Community Health Service runs. At Mutijulu, the community at Uluru, the Ngunnawal Mutijulunya Community Care Service runs. It's an amazing old people's home. I've been in quite a few of them, and it's full of light and life and great energy. And other programs run by others. There are family and child services, including family violence services. There are national peaks such as SNAKE, there's ABSEC, which is the Family, Child and Community Peak in New South Wales, and then at a more local level, for instance, in Alice Springs, Tangagira Council provides a range of services, and again, many others. And then there are youth, children and childcare services. So from Children's Ground, which is a charity doing very innovative work in Central Australia and Arnhem Land, there's VACA in Victoria providing childcare services, and a lot of others. So I'm just trying to give a sense of the huge scope of service provision. The second category are land-based organisations, most of which have a legislative base. So we've already had it right. Reference to the Northern Land Council, there's the Central Land Council, that's my hurry up, which were established by Commonwealth legislation that applies only in the Northern Territory. There's New South Wales Aboriginal Land Councils, again set up under legislation there, that's the peak body for 120 land councils. There's former missions and reserves that have been granted to Aboriginal ownership, such as in Lake Conga and Framlingham in Victoria. There are heritage protection organisations, native title representative bodies, the registered native title bodies that actually hold the native title rights and interests once it's been granted by the court, and organisations holding Indigenous protected areas and others. And I can't resist, despite the time, mentioning that the Gunditjmara Budgebim area was recently accepted for World Heritage Cultural Listing, which is extraordinary recognition. That's fine, they haven't, which is a great thing. And the other thing to bear in mind is a lot of those organisations actually provide a form of local government, both in terms of municipal services, but it can also head into self-government, where people actually participate in the decisions being made about their country. Very rapidly, there are economic development organisations across the country, many of which are also land-based. So they might be in receipt of money under land rights or native title, and they're developing financial different business interests. There are cattle stations, agriculture, aquaculture, construction and design, art centres. I'm reading as fast as I can. And Selwyn's got some things he wants to say about economic development, enterprise and charitable trusts, how that is a complex area of law that doesn't necessarily well serve its purpose. I'll give you just one tip, and that is, for all of the lawyers, if you're working with Aboriginal organisations and you're drafting or modifying rules, can you please make sure that the decision-making process that's set out in the rules reflects what the people actually do? Now, you're likely to have to spend some time and observe and then consult and get instructions, and that might take some time. But if you draft rules that don't reflect the decision-making process they're actually using, you're just setting them up to fail. And well-intended administrators come in, and often the first thing they do is change the rules to make them look a lot more like a white-collar organisation, and in my view, that's not always helpful. On that note, I'll hand over to Sylvia.
Thanks, Eddie. Can I start by acknowledging traditional owners of the land that we're meeting today? Thanks to their elders past and present. I'm from Queensland, I'm not from Victoria, so it's a little bit cold for me coming down here this morning. It's actually colder than Canberra today here. I have been in Canberra earlier this week. I'm not a solicitor, so I'm not going to talk you through a process about legislation. What I'm going to talk to you is about some of the issues and difficulties that I see as a regulator. And certainly working with Aboriginal organisations, Indigenous organisations across the country, what are some of the conversations that I'm having with a lot of the native title bodies? So, Anne started to touch on some of the things that are going on in the registered native title body corps, and those who are corporations that look after determined land once they've gone through a native title claim. I'm going to talk specifically about some issues that are sitting in that particular area that I think you may be able to provide some solutions to, or you may be able to support a regulator to come up with some ideas about how we might be able to come up with a new regime. Our act is the CATSI Act, the Corporations, the Aboriginal China Corporations Act. That's the act that I guess governs the work that we do. We have around 3,100 corporations across the country. Of those, there's a little over 200. I think it was only in the last month or so we had our 200th determination in Australia, which is a fairly significant piece. Of those 200, and I want to put some context around, of those 200, there's only about 20% of them, so 20 odd, that are deriving any commercial benefit from native title determined land. It's only a very small amount. We have lots and lots of corporations across the country who have determined land or are looking after it on behalf of common law holders, but they're not deriving any financial benefit from it. It is purely for them to look after based upon traditional affiliation to the land and what they're doing to continue those cultures and practices. So just when we talk about native title benefits, when we talk about conversations in terms of mining royalties and everything else, not everyone is getting access to that. So I want to make it very clear that just because we've gone through a process of High Court determination doesn't mean that we then automatically derive economic benefit. Now, getting to the economic benefit piece, I'm going to posit this for you. What we have in those 20-odd corporations across the country is a range of charitable trusts, some that are controlled by Indigenous groups themselves, some that are controlled by external entities. In those charitable trusts, sitting in bank accounts in those charitable trusts across the country, what we estimate at the moment is around $20 billion. So think about that just for a second, that what we estimate across all of those is around $20 billion that's sitting there. Now the reason why it's sitting there is a couple of things, and I'm going to get to that piece. But if you think in the context of $20 billion, you think in the context of what Anne was talking about around decision making, if we combine the two to make sure we have improvement around effective decision making for communities and corporations and $20 billion, and we bring those things together, just imagine what could happen in terms of the progress around closing the gap. Just imagine what Indigenous communities could do and could decide to do and have a crack at if we combine good decision-making practices with $20 billion. We're not talking about any additional money. We're not talking about government dollars. We're actually talking about money that has been granted to them based upon a negotiation and agreement with a mining company, with other entities around the place. So if $20 million is combined with good decision making, we can certainly go a long way to achieving what is essentially the 6 or the 7 close the gap targets across the country. Why I want to posit that with you now is then we take a step back to work out why is it not being spent the way it should be or is intended in terms of the consequence itself. And there's a couple of things. There was a Treasury report that came out in 2013. There was a group that got together that provided advice to Treasury around native title benefits. What they talked about is the difficulties in relation to charitable status and the charitable laws as well as taxation laws. Because what we're talking about here is using that money to look at some projected expenditure and growth and deriving income and revenue to then support collective. And because of the nuances in those sorts of things, it was very, very difficult, and it still remains very difficult for a lot of the native title bodies to use that money because the uncertainty around the treatment of tax and the uncertainty of how it needs to sit in terms of charitable law becomes a bit of a grey area. So what happens when it's a grey area is that many of those groups don't spend it. Many of them just leave the money sit there thinking it's way too difficult for us to navigate the entire system, so we're not going to go down the path of spending the money because we might get penalised. That's why we've got the money sitting in those accounts. 2015, there was a Northern Australian white paper. The Northern Australian white paper talks about this part of the Indigenous estate, talks about the money that's sitting in charitable trusts, and talks about the economic benefit that can be derived from this, and provided some ways and means of looking at improving that. But again, we need to come back to looking at taxation law and coming out looking at charities law to work out what can we do that's going to open up the door for these things to occur. So I'm going to leave something with you, and certainly this is a conversation we've been having with the National Native Title Council, who've done some work with the Minerals Council. Native Title Council just down the road here, in actual fact. And the work that they've done is to look at what might be a new regulatory regime around this whole notion of an economic vehicle status for those prescribed body corps, the registered native title body corporations. And what they're proposing is that within the CATSI Act, so the Act, because of the fact that each one of those registered native title body corps has to be registered under the CATSI Act and regulated by ORIC, because that is part of the process for them, let's create a specific provision within the CATSI Act that focuses on economic status and creates an economic vehicle status as a subsidiary to each one of those native title body corps that enables them to reap the benefits of the money they've got sitting in charitable trusts, enables them to use it to better support, and focuses on what's, I guess, one of the ideals of charitable law in the first instance, about alleviating poverty. So that's what we're attempting to do. And I guess I would leave you with that in the sense that we're now going to go back to for consultations around the CATS Act. So my agency will work with the new National Indigenous Australians Agency on looking at changes to the CATS Act throughout this year. And certainly on what we will be putting on the table is whether or not this will be something that will support PBC, something that supports Indigenous people, and something that starts to drive economic development in communities using what's already sitting in their bank accounts to make sure that communities reap the benefit from it. Not about individual gain. It's absolutely not about individual gain. This is about collective gain and communities benefiting from it, and making sure that that money is coming back to support the entire community itself. And we keep focused on that whole notion of alleviating poverty for Indigenous people. So I'll leave it there. Thank
you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I think it's still morning just. So I'm Jacinta. I'm from the Australian Taxation Office, and I am a manager or a director in the not-for-profit centre, so managing all the not-for-profits. But here today I'll talk specifically about some of the challenges and the issues from a tax perspective, and just the environment we sit there with this part of the sector, in particular in relation to the native title side of things. So there are over 600,000 charities or not-for-profits we expect out there. We have about 201,000 that are registered in our tax system. And of those, and I wanted just to be able to highlight part of this, about 56,000 of those receive tax concessions. So for us, it's about supporting a different way of supporting communities through the access of tax concessions to do those things that they were actually set up for, and to make sure where they go. Certainly within this sector, and it was highlighted earlier, there are billions of dollars sitting in this space, either have been applied and been used, been run as the cost of administrations, or set up for the future funds for the future. There are challenges around understanding the access to tax concessions and make sure that's right. The roles of trustees and the regulators in this space are really important. I was lucky enough to attend a native title workshop a few weeks ago, and the amount of stakeholders that were involved in trying to manage, whether they're regulators, PBCs, trustees, it is a landfill and a landmine there to be able to navigate and work through that. You've got the tension of a lot of history in that space. So trying to work through and understand what that would mean, and sort of picking up on a point earlier, making decisions and having implications, and making sure that actually is what's happening in the communities and where it needs to go, and understanding the implications of all those different laws and jurisdictions to make sure where that needs to go is something that is a continual struggle. Being able to reach and educate sort of within that community, and making sure it's doing what it needs to do is an ongoing challenge. Many of the structures have been noted in the past are impossible to manage. They vary, they're not always consistent, so it's difficult. From a tax perspective, we've touched on the fact that there are different taxing implications within this space. So whether they're exempt categories, there are quite a number that employ and have employer obligations within this part of the sector, understanding how they work and they're supported for what that needs to be, indirect tax issues as well. And we understand, and the ATO understands that role that we play as a regulator, and what that needs to be with bodies like the ACNC as well, making sure that we've got both of our two sets of things that we need to manage under, but how do they come together collectively to manage part of that target audience. Yeah, and I touched on the implications of the future funds. So what happens with initial determinations for those that do get the money that come through, and how does that get set aside, and how do we manage some of that? So there are things that I think from an ATO perspective that I've certainly seen for things to watch out for and be mindful with reflections is I do see a bit of consistency around a lack of understanding and knowing where to go to be able to seek assistance and get the support that's required. Some are very well resourced, others are much smaller and are not. Those smaller organisations, they have the same level of compliance and that same regulatory environment they need to work in. So being able to try and navigate, well or not, through that can often be very difficult. The intention of what those native title determinations and what those structures are set up for and ensuring they go to those purposes. You see many instances where that happens, other times it's very difficult, and that balance between the cost of administration and getting the right people in, the infrastructure can be really difficult around things. You've got mining corporations that are in there with different roles too. And it is certainly our laws now we're trying to put into a different community who have different sets of laws, so there's often tension in relation to that. The role and the responsibility of trustees, how our ability to work with those and where that would be is something that I've certainly noted. The operating for purpose and making sure it's there, unfortunately, going to remote communities like that is and can be very costly, and understand. But there is always that concern that people aren't in the business of supporting or trying to take some of that pie. So that making sure it is going for the purposes in which it was established, for the good and the reasons why it was there in the first place, that operating for purpose and continuing is really important. Some of the takeouts for myself and our agency were really being fit for purpose in how we deliver that support. So making sure that if we are going to use tools like webinars and checklist, if they're not accessible to communities like that, then it's probably nearly close to a waste of time. So we need to be really fit for purpose and tailored as to how we might look at different roles and what that would be in there to make sure that it's there. Certainly acknowledge some of the comments that were made earlier in earlier sessions about having some certainty around binding advice, where it's on like terms, being clear about what that is and what instructions are at different levels for advisors. Another comment that was reflected in the discussion earlier this morning that just want to talk about is when we look to have new pieces of policy or design that we're looking at considering it, the question was put to the regulators about how we manage that and what we would do. And I know certainly from the NFP Centre point of view, we want to be really clear to use things like our stewardship group meetings to be able to test and actually socialise some of these things, and we've done that in some other examples more recently. So for me, that is something that we're very keen to make sure we're not delivering thinking it's going to be wonderful if it's not going to work. And I think the Indigenous space is something that does have some unique characteristics. So thank you.